Moscow, October 20th, 1982. A freezing night grips the capital of the Soviet Union. Inside the Luzhniki Stadium, then called the Grand Sports Arena of the Central Lenin Stadium, Spartak Moscow take on Haarlem from the Netherlands. Only 16,000 fans show up despite the 80,000 maximum capacity. A grand exterior was contrasted by the reality inside the stadium. It's a midweek round of 16 European UEFA Cup tie, but not too much attention was paid to it. Quiet, cold, and very uneventful. But by the end of the night, dozens of people would be dead. Some say it was 66, others say it was 300. And for years, almost nobody outside the USSR would ever know. This is the story of the disaster that happened in the Soviet Union, which they tried to erase. A moment of chaos buried under silence. This is the Luzhniki disaster. The Luzhniki Stadium was the pride of Soviet sport. Opened in 1956, it held over 80,000 people. It had hosted the controversial 1980 Olympic Games, where the host won 195 medals, 80 of which were gold. It was a stage for nationalism, for propaganda, and also for a bit of football. But the stadium had problems. Exits were limited, corridors for fans were very narrow, and safety protocols were, well, at best, very basic. After the 1980 Olympics, the Soviet Union officials tightened their grip on large venues. Stadiums weren't just sports arenas, they were showcases of state control. The Luzhniki Stadium, like many other Soviet structures, was built to be a spectacle, not for safe crowd movement. Police were focused on order and using any kinds of force to maintain it. There was no thought for safety or evacuations. That night, Spartak were hosting Haarlem in a second round first leg tie in the UEFA Cup. It was East versus West. Soviet teams took European competition seriously, even in the early rounds. So fans showed up, but not many, despite the snow, the cold, and the low stakes. With so few fans, only a fraction of the stadium was used, and with this, only a single stairwell was open, meaning all fans were forced into the same area. This staircase would simply be known as Stairway 1. It was narrow, steep, slippery, and partially frozen, yet the local authorities assumed it would be okay and more than enough, meaning that they blocked off and locked all the other exits. Because in the Soviet system, control was everything. You weren't allowed to go where they didn't want you to go. Appearance and how people saw the Soviet Union mattered more than safety, and that choice would soon cost multiple lives. The match itself was uneventful. Spartak scored early thanks to a goal by midfielder Edgar Guess in the 16th minute. But not much happened in the rest of the game. So fans began leaving before full time, trying to beat the cold to get home. Thousands were funneled into Stairway 1, one direction, downhill, slow, but at that moment it was manageable. Then in the final moments, Spartak scored again, a last-minute goal by defender Sergei Shvetsov. 2-0 and the victory clinched in the final moments. The small crowd inside the stadium roared in celebration. But outside on the stairs, some fans turned around and came back to the stands. They wanted to rush back and see all the celebration, while others stopped still on the stairs to listen. Two waves of people collided head-on in a narrow staircase. Those leaving to go home, and those trying to return. And that's when it began, the chaos. People started to fall. The stairs were slick with ice. Bodies slipped, stumbled, tumbled and fell. There were no ushers, no guidance, no signs of basic safety. And of course, there was no warning. Soon, a pile of bodies formed on the staircase. Layer after layer of people falling over one another. The pressure increased. People at the bottom couldn't breathe. They couldn't move, unable to scream for help. Some were crushed to death by the traffic on top of them. Others slowly suffocated while trying to gasp for air. Some tried to climb the handrails to safety. Only a few escaped. But many more were buried. And the noise? It wasn't loud. It was a dull, terrifying silence. From the celebration of the goal to a scene of pure chaos. No help came. Security forces were confused, thinking it was a brawl. They didn't understand what was happening until it was far too late. The players on the pitch? Clueless. They had no idea what was happening just meters away. Haarlem captain Martin Hart also knew nothing about the events unfolding in the stands. I remember we had to leave the stadium really quickly afterwards. This was an attempt from the Soviet Union to get potential witnesses outside the regime out, restricting what the opposing team could potentially see and learn about. Corpses were stacked near the monument to Lenin before being taken to the morgue at 6 a.m. the next day. In the end, 66 deaths were officially recorded, but eyewitnesses insist that the number was much higher. 100, 200 or even 300. Some say it was even more. We may never know, because the Soviet Union didn't just lose control, it tried to cover it up. To the Soviet Union, this never happened, and these people never existed. In a free country, this would have been front page news, but in the Soviet Union, it barely made a whisper. The next day, one local newspaper, the Even in Moscow, printed this short note. On the 20th of October 1982, after the football match at the Grand Sports Arena of the Central Lenin Stadium, as spectators were on their way out, an accident took place due to disturbances in the movement of people. There were casualties. An investigation into the circumstances of the accident is underway. That was all. No names, no details, just a vague statement. However, two national sports papers, the Sovietsky Sport and Football Hockey, ran full match reports, player ratings, goals, statistics, substitutes, the whole lot. But neither said a single word about the disaster. And then, silence. Nothing more was heard. There were no televised funerals, no public mourning. Families were warned not to speak out in fear of punishment. The Soviet Union did not want people to know at any cost. They did what they felt was needed. Some parents were paid quietly in compensation, but only if they stayed silent. No more Spartak matches were scheduled for late October, in an attempt to stop families laying flowers or otherwise marking their loss. Once again, another cruel tactic to suppress the grieving families and brush the deaths under the carpet, acting as if this disaster never happened. A way to spark no more questions about that fateful evening. But then, the tragedy became a rumour. A whispered past between fans, students and stadium workers. Many believed it didn't happen at all. How could they, when they saw no news about it? The state had completely erased it. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union would survivors begin to speak without fear. But by then, after so many years, memories were hazy. Witnesses questioned their own eyes and what they saw. The photos were few, and the records, they were almost non-existent to the public. In the months that followed, 4 officials were charged in connection with the disaster. Alexander Speer, the detective who led the investigation, contended that all the gates were open. The stadium director, the stadium manager, a deputy director, and the chief of police for the East Stand were all charged. 2 of them stood trial in February 1983 and were found guilty of negligence and receiving a 3-year prison sentence. But even those sentences were cut short. One was released immediately under state amnesty, and the other had his sentence halved. The remaining 2 avoided trial due to medical reasons. One had a heart attack, the other reportedly got injured while trying to help. Eventually, both were also granted amnesty. In the end, no one served serious time. A regime so obsessed with control, even the justice system only served appearances. Trials were held quietly, penalties were short-lived, and no one truly paid the price. In 1989, during Gorbachev's reforms, the state finally admitted that the disaster happened, swallowing their pride. As a result, a small plaque was installed at the Luzhniki Stadium. It reads, "In memory of the victims of the tragedy of October 20th, 1982. No names, no context, just withheld information, the way the Soviet Union liked it. Simply a single line carved in stone. Without recognizing the tragedy took place, you wouldn't know what the plaque was for." In 2007, the second goal scorer Sergei Shvetsov told UEFA, "I wish I hadn't scored that goal," a memory that haunted the stadium. The Luzhniki has since been rebuilt. It hosted the 2018 World Cup final when France beat Croatia 4-2. Millions watched as Kylian Mbappe made his name on the international stage. Very few knew what happened there decades earlier. The Luzhniki disaster still lacks global recognition. Unlike Hillsborough or Hazel, it remains mostly forgotten outside of Russia. Because it wasn't televised, it wasn't public, and it simply wasn't allowed to exist. not until the regime was gone. But for the families of those who died, for the fans who lived through it, the trauma remained sharp. This was not just a crowd crush or a fight as security believed. The truth was deliberately denied. It was a moment when lives were lost, the youngest being Sergei Bagayev, aged 14. The Luzhniki disaster was a tragedy, but it also was a warning of what happens when control is prioritized over care, where safety for supporters and others is not a priority, when silence is a policy which must be enforced, and when human lives are treated as political liabilities or potential smears on a regime. Dozens died, maybe hundreds, and for years, survivors' grief was suffocated just like those who tragically died. They didn't even have a voice, suppressed for years, but now they do, and it's up to us to remember them, to speak their names, and to ensure that their story is never buried again.